Returning to the program is Professor Robert Gjerdingen, Professor Emeritus of Music at Northwestern University's School of Music. He is well known for his research in music schemata theory, Partimento, and is an expert in music of the 18th century. His previous book was the influential 2007 book, Music in the Galant Style, and he has a new book out entitled Child Composers in the Old Conservatories, How Orphans Became Elite Musicians. He is also very actively updating his new website, partimenti.org. Professor Gjerdingen, it's a real pleasure to have you back on the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
This is a really excellent book because it shows how frighteningly impressive these children were at music. My head spins at how skilled they were at things like counterpoint, keyboard playing, composition. I don't really know many adults today who can match their craftsman-like skill. But before we dive into it, could I just get a little background? How did you come to write this book after Music in the Galant Style?
Well, it was the influence of parents of prodigies. I think because I've been associated with Alma Deutscher a little bit, the British prodigy, that I've gotten calls over the years from parents of other very talented children. And I suppose you could say that I noticed that, like parents often are when they have exceptional children, that they're really curious about what is possible and how other children were trained in the past. And because I knew about how the old conservatories would take in children and really do wonderful things with them, I would recommend some of these things. But then the parents would want to know more. And so I thought, well, maybe I should put all this information together in a book. And so Oxford was willing to publish it, not as a book for music specialists, musicologists, but for a more general audience. So it's not, well, I shouldn't say it's not too technical. I mean, a lot of this stuff is nerdy, but it's readable, at least, if you don't have a lot of technical knowledge in music. And then also there's 100 YouTube videos that go with it. So even if you can barely read music, you can certainly listen to what the musical examples are displaying.
Do you still conduct research into music schemata theory? Is that something that you still actively participate in?
Yes. I mean, it's you sort of can't help it when you listen to music from that era. You know, these patterns keep popping up all the time. And then, well, there's a couple other prodigies that I've been helping, and it's just very interesting to see them sort of see the light bulbs turn on as they learn various musical patterns and learn to improvise and things like that.
You mentioned Alma Deutscher. Could I ask you, how long did you work with her, and what specifically did you work on with her in her music training?
Oh, okay. Well, I always worked through her father. In my early days of dealing with prodigies, I was really hesitant to push a prodigy to do anything. You know, I mean, there's a fine line between guiding a child and child abuse, you know. I mean, if you think of the world of competitive gymnastics or Olympic swimming or something like that, you know, some of these children are really exploited. And so I was really leery about getting too close to a prodigy. And I just wanted to assist the parents. So I would send exercises to her father, Guy Deutscher, and then he would, you know, if appropriate, would pass them on to Alma. And so we worked like that, mostly on partimenti and simple composition exercises. And, you know, I knew early on that she was really quite remarkable. I mean, there was the greatest, you know, a combination of Elvis Presley and Barbra Streisand and every great singer you can think of was the Italian singer Farinelli in the 18th century. He was so famous. Well, there was nothing like it. He was the most famous musician of that century. And he had written some solfeggi, vocal exercises. But we've lost the basses that went with them. So I sent Alma one of his melodies and asked her to provide a bass. And, in a few days, her father sent back her response, and it was a beautiful bass in 16th notes like the melody was. And it was, thoroughly in the style, very tasteful. It was just amazing. She wasn't just thinking, oh, well, maybe a 4-chord will go here. It was a completely fluent expression like an 18th century musician would make, probably like Farinelli would do himself. So, she was really quite remarkable. But I do work with a couple other kids that have similar kind of abilities. And I suppose in general you could say children are amazing.
For the subject of your book, you tackle the conservatories of Naples, and you also talk about the Paris Conservatory. You talk about how they became elite musicians. Now, somebody today would say, well, we have a lot of young kids who play their instrument at a very high level. They go to instrumental competitions. What's the difference between our kids today and these kids, 200, 300 years ago?
Well, there are a lot of differences, certainly. I mean, the worlds are so different. There was no Facebook or YouTube or television or telephone or anything. But I suppose the biggest difference is that if you're a great violinist today, let's say a Midori or Anna Sophie Mutter or any number of virtuosi, you play the repertory, and you play it very well, amazingly well, probably as well as it's ever been played. But you don't play your own concertos, and you don't even play your own cadenzas. You're basically a reproducing kind of machine, a marvelous, amazing reproducing machine, but it's not like you're playing your own music, And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, Elvis Presley didn't write music. He always sang somebody else's songs. Same with Frank Sinatra. But the Beatles did play their own songs. And in some sense, the Beatles get rated a bit higher, I think, for that. In these earlier centuries, the children were trained to do it all. So they could play somebody else's concerto, but they could play their own too. And in fact, most of the great performers of the past, we remember them because we still play their concertos. Sarasate, for example, in the violin, or Vinyavsky, Erliotti, whole series of these people. Rachmaninoff in piano, Liszt, Chopin. We don't remember them for playing somebody else's music. So the difference is that they were trained to be all-around musicians who could go to a city and set up an orchestra, maybe a choir, produce music for festivals and occasions, and maybe an opera. And so they were fully fluent in the music, and they could do it all.
That's my next question, which is, what was the job description of a graduate of a Naples conservatory?
Well, it made a difference as to whether you went to work for the church or for a royal or a princely court. So there's you might say, a sacred versus secular split in the jobs. So, for example, we know a lot about a guy who was trained in Naples and then became the chief musician in the island of Malta in the Mediterranean. And he had to, conduct the choir, manage organists, small ensembles, and then write all the music for those ensembles. And all that music is preserved, actually, today. For a church musician, the job was to ornament and decorate sonically the various services and liturgies. But for a secular musician at a court, it was mostly about entertainment. Now, they might have managed the music for the religious services at that court, but they were probably hired on the basis of their ability to make entertaining music and to teach the children of the ruler.
Now, it seems amazing what they can do with counterpoint, and at the end of their course, they could write fugues, they could improvise fugues. Was fugal writing, was that part and parcel of their kind of professional work? Is that something, or is it kind of overkill in terms of like musical skill? Was fugal writing very important in their day-to-day jobs?
Well, yes. I mean, counterpoint was everywhere and was expected. And I think we need to demystify fugue a little bit. You know, when most of us encounter fugues, it's from the works of J.S. Bach. And these are monumental, amazing creations. It's like if you walk into St. Mark's in Venice, I mean, it's just, you know, it's a wow moment. And the fugues of Bach are definitely wow, and you think, how could anybody do that? But these little children, they didn't write those kind of fugues. They wrote much simpler ones. And they started out with two-voice fugues. Two-voice fugues are actually very manageable. You can teach somebody to do a two-voice fugue fairly easily. So they had a way into it that we generally don't recognize today anymore. So they just grew into fugues, and they learned a lot of tricks of the trade, you might say. And they could improvise fugues. Now, there are a few organists in the world that can still do that. But again, it tends to be the result of some concentrated training over a number of years.
Now, if we step back a little bit and talk about their instrumental playing, I understand that they sang for a good number of years with a particular type of method of Italian solfeggio. You actually said something very interesting. You commented about music education today, and you talked about movable do, and this is what you said. You said, the worst method for Italian solfeggio may be movable do. And we know movable do is very popular in music education today. What are the problems with movable do?
Movable do was developed for Protestant churches in England and Northern Europe in the 19th century. This was, the hymns that they sang were very simple. They tended not to modulate much or at all. And one of the motivations was that it made music printing cheap. You didn't have to print music note heads. You could just print the letters of the solfeggio symbols. So DRM, DRM, MFS, MFS. You could print Three Blind Mice just by typing those letters. And local presses could print this music with letters instead of having to have complicated fonts that could do music, which is quite difficult. So, it was designed for a completely different purpose than what a professional musician would do. Well, for example, if someone is good at movable do, and bless their heart, and I ask them to, now let's sing a Mass by Palestrina. Well, let's say it starts on D, and then it has some G major chords, and then it has some A major sound. Well, what syllables are they going to use? Generally, they can't answer that question because it's not in D minor, and it's not in G major, and it's not in A major. And, major and minor key is not the be-all and end-all of Palestrina's work. And the same would be true for a piece by Hindemith, for example. Whereas if somebody was trained in French conservatory style, where, a C is do no matter what, they can solfège Palestrina without any trouble. It's the same thing. And same with the Hindemith. Now, the old Neapolitan style, which is more complicated and probably would help if you started at a very early age, that also would not draw any distinctions between Palestrina and Heinrich Schütz and Mozart and Berlioz. It would work for all of those things equally well. Solfeggio systems, especially movable do, they try to do too much with a syllable. In the French style, the syllable tells you that, okay, this is a C. It might be a C sharp, might be a flat, but it's a C. That's all you need to know. Thank you, move on. But in movable do, the idea is, okay, it's a C and it's the third scale degree of a major key. Okay, but maybe suddenly it's the fifth scale degree of a minor key. Do you need to change a syllable quickly? What if you don't know what scale degree it is? The solfeggio came out of a world where scale degrees weren't important, and they had nothing to do with scale degrees, even in Mozart's time, believe it or not. Or at least they had less to do than they do today. None of this would be really a big problem if you were dealing with children, because children can learn to deal with things. Okay, let's say it's a messed up system and you're giving it to children. They'll find their way through it. They'll get some benefit from it. But let's say instead that you have young adults in a university. Young adults do not learn the same way as children. Children learn things as a first language. Young adults learn things as a second language. So a young adult in a university comes to an exercise, and the exercise is, okay, they're never going to be able to do that, ever. They'll be stumbling over what syllable to pick. They'll never get past that. You can walk by solfeggio classes in universities using movable do, and you can guarantee two things, that things will be out of tune and slow, because the students can't concentrate on the music. They're concentrating on trying to find the darn syllable.
Let's say after the 3 years of solfeggio that they did at these conservatories, then they would perhaps start Partimento, but they would also do these things called intavolatures, which you mentioned in the book. And these seem to be beginning keyboard pieces that children would learn, perhaps to learn to play on the keyboard, and they were realized simple pieces. How extensively were these beginning keyboard pieces or intavolature used in these conservatories?
I wish I knew. It's a really good question. Everything is unclear about intavolature. The word is the same word that guitarists use when they say a tab, a tablature.
Tablature.
Yeah, it's a tab, meaning it's a fully written out piece, unlike a Partimento, And we know next to nothing about how they were used. Clearly all the composers in their late teens or early 20s could play the harpsichord well, and the organ. It was just assumed. Conductors conducted from the harpsichord. And all of the chapel masters being trained in Naples were assumed to be able to take that kind of job. So you might say, we know the starting point, which is 0, and we know the ending point, which is fluency on the keyboard. And we know that they did a lot of partimenti somewhere in the middle, but somehow they had to get some skill on the keyboard. And we do have this somewhat mysterious repertory of things called intavolature. Now, to make it worse, other things are also called intavolature. So I guess you would call it an educated guess.
What are some good, easy keyboard works that you might recommend for parents or teachers to try with students or kids who are just learning the piano?
Okay. There are sonatinas by Clementi, little sonatas by Clementi that have always been fairly useful for beginning pianists. Some of the earliest works of Mozart, little harpsichord pieces, are good for early players. These intavolature that are up on partimenti.org can work in the same way. And then also, it's easy to overlook this, but solfeggi are excellent beginner piano pieces.
If I was a violinist, would I need to sing and play the keyboard?
Yes, because there were jobs at certain princely courts, you might say pure violin jobs, but they would have been in the minority. Most musicians would, play in a court orchestra perhaps, or in a cathedral orchestra, but they would be expected to do other things, to teach a choir, to teach choir boys. They had to be able to do all those things.
So even if I played guitar or cello or trumpet, I would have been expected to have some fluency on the keyboard and also singing as well.
Yes, as far as we know.
Okay. Why did the Neapolitans place so much importance on singing?
Well, they were in a singing culture, you might say. Singers were the most famous musicians that there were. Everybody sang. I guess, it's a little bit like the guitar today in popular culture. It's just assumed if you're a pop musician that you can play the guitar, even if that's not your main thing. Whereas, in earlier centuries, it was harpsichord or violin. But yeah, there was an Italian proverb that went, si canta, si suona, which means if you can sing, you can play. In other words, if your mind controls your voice in a musical way, you can control an instrument. You just need to learn the basics.
When kids take music lessons today, they maybe see a teacher once a week. What was the scale, like how many hours a day did a kid at one of these conservatories put into music?
There is a daily schedule given in the Child Composer's book, a couple of different ones from different places. But I think it's fair to say 3 to 4 hours a day. And then, of course, there were meals, there was some playtime, there was study of language and maybe Latin. There are classes sometimes listed as science, but I think they were probably a combination of learning to add and subtract and, some very basic things. They didn't get a great education outside of music, but the music education was, well, it didn't have to be intense each day because it was 6 days a week and no vacation.
Is it the same class, like for instance, if you took Partimento, was Partimento every day or was it like 3 times a week or 2 times a week?
Some of those kind of questions are really hard to answer because we're talking about a 200-year span of time and lots of different teachers. But I think in general it was every day for 1 or 2 hours. And it was, teaching the Partimento class was about half of the job of the music master, the head teacher, So it was intense, but I think the real secret was that it was sustained.
You also mentioned the Paris Conservatory, and you mentioned the Paris Conservatory is kind of a successor to the methods of the Italian Neapolitan school. And it's really interesting how you put the history of the connections and even someone like Debussy. Did he study Partimenti?
Yes, but they may have just called it improvisation. It was in the first class of keyboard work, which was sometimes called accompaniment, which is a French word for figured bass. So in the class of accompaniment, that was Debussy won his highest prize in all the classes that he took. He eventually won the Prix de Rome, which was the top prize in composition. But in terms of classes, the only time he got a first prize was in improvised keyboard playing. And one of his classmates talking about this called that work playing Partimenti.
Oh, really? Wow.
So sometimes the word was used, the Italian word was used, and other times it wasn't. But the French had always, since the early 18th century, the French had imported Italian musicians with the idea that, well, these are the best. I'm an aristocrat. I want the best. And so when the Paris Conservatory was started, Naples trained musicians were important advisors. They were on the boards. They helped set it up. And lots of people trained in Naples or Bologna. They became professors.
Is there any clear difference between the methods of the Bologna and the Neapolitan traditions?
Yeah, really good question. Bologna was not as systematized. You didn't have hundreds of children. You had just private lessons and a couple people. It was more like an old-time apprenticeship system. And it had a more historical orientation. Padre Martini was quite a fine scholar of music history, whereas that did not seem to fit into Naples much at all. But I think I have to be honest and say I don't know as much about Bologna. Professor Peter von Tour is working on the Bolognese situation right now in terms of research, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what he says. That there are far fewer maestros in Bologna, far fewer students, but on the other hand, it was the creme de la creme. I mean, Padre Martini taught Stanislao Mattei, who taught Rossini, Donizetti, and other people like that. I mean, really, really heavy hitters.
Mozart.
Yes. Now, when the Paris Conservatory was being set up, which was 1795, Naples was in revolt against Napoleon's armies. And so several of the early professors had connections with Bologna instead of Naples. And I think that's probably because Naples was considered a rogue province.
With regard to the Paris Conservatory, you have a very interesting anecdote where you talk about a young Henry Bousseur, a talented student who was entering the conservatory. And did he get blackballed by a teacher of harmony? What was the story there?
Yeah, Theodore Dubois, who became director of the conservatory. And I think it's because Bousseur did not know the tricks, what you were supposed to do. I'm guessing Bousseur just turned in a kind of chordal accompaniment to the bass or soprano that he was supposed to harmonize. Whereas you were expected to do a very interesting contrapuntal version of these things. Yeah, I mean, harmony is the word that the French use for these courses, but in truth, they were mostly about counterpoint. If you look at a 400-page treatise on harmony, there's about 4 pages that talk about tonality and scales, and then you have 396 pages of counterpoint. So it's basically it was literally the exact Neapolitan curriculum. I mean, it was published. It's hard to believe, but Debussy's teacher, for example, in the written harmony course, assigned Fenaroli Partimenti to be harmonized.
Really?
Yeah. So I mean, it's like the Italian thing never died. To understand it a little bit, it might help to realize that the Paris Conservatory and what was called the School of Fine Arts, the École des Beaux-Arts, which was the art school, they were both under the administration of the Institute of France, and they were both set up in the same way. They had the same contests, they had the same pay scales for the professors. They were administratively like twins. And the goal of the School of Fine Arts was to teach, it was a goal of the Renaissance, which was to create a rebirth of classical art by studying the classics. And so in fine art, you studied Greek and Roman statuary mostly and architecture. Now in music, there is no ancient music that they could turn to. I mean, nothing of any practical use. So they chose Italian music of the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries as the classical tradition. So the goal of the Paris Conservatory for much of its existence was to train musicians in the classics, and that meant the Italian tradition. The interest in French music as a model actually came rather late, and it was news and exciting to people like Debussy and Ravel. You know, they got all excited about it, but actual music history courses only came around in the 1870s at the Paris Conservatory. Prior to that, there was no such thing.
You mentioned French music, and obviously Rameau is a very big figure in French music theory, music history, and he had his treatise on harmony, which talked about chords and chord inversions, fundamental bass. And how did that jive with the Paris Conservatory?
It never had any influence there. I mean, that may be a slight overstatement, but Cattell, who was one of the early authors of a widely used harmony book at the Paris Conservatory, he basically said, well, yes, there is Rameau, but we don't deal with that. That's kind of science. We don't do that. We're practical. So, Ravel's harmony book is ambiguous and about practical things. I mean, he was a great musician, maybe the greatest musician ever to write a harmony book. But it was a speculative project. You know, I mean, the title says it's a theory of harmony, a treatise on harmony reduced to its natural principles. So, he thought that music was based on nature, and there's no evidence for that. but it's a very attractive idea.
Okay, this is really making me interested now in the history of how we got to the present situation. How did we get Nadia Boulanger, who is doing these exercises with figured bass and basses and partimenti, and we have an American system where we have Roman numerals, we have chords, we have kind of a different system. And I know that, for instance, Walter Piston, his book is very influential.
Yeah, and he studied with Nadia
And
Boulanger.
so what happened there?
Oh, well, it's very simple. There's an influential 1926 book by Archibald T. Davidson, who was the Glee Club director at Harvard, but also an early musicologist, one of the founders of the American Musicological Society. His book is titled Music Education in America. What's wrong with it? What can we do about it? The truth was that, there's a class distinction. In America, we like to pretend that we don't have different social classes. But, in Europe, musicians were in the lower classes. They worked with their hands. They were artisans. And the people who went to universities were upper and middle class. Okay? They took courses. They could take a course in geology, but they didn't learn how to become a miner, right? they didn't dig coal in the dirt. They just read about it. So, you had a choice. You could become a kind of slave to a music education, spend 10 years as an apprentice, and then work in a fairly poorly paid job as a professional musician. Or you could be a middle or upper class person and take a course about music. It would last 14 weeks, and you'd learn a little about this and that, and then you'd go on and do whatever you were going to do otherwise. So there's this class distinction. And so the American universities had to decide, exactly what is music. Is it a subject, or is it a vocation? Is it a lifetime project in motor and mental development, or is it a subject that you read about? You could read about bacteria in one class, and then in the next class you could read about chords. So the people that had to push music into the university were the same people that helped develop Roman numerals. In fact, one of Stanislaw Matej's students in Bologna was Christian Weinlig, a Dresden organist who taught Richard Wagner and Clara Wieck, Clara Schumann, and also Richter, who was author of one of the first sort of Roman numeral harmony books in Germany. Anyway, this is all to say that Roman numerals are a kind of social adaptation to a class full of students who know nothing about music. And so it's a pretend game. We'll pretend that every chord is one of 7 choices. And if you can find which of the 7 it is, you'll pass the course. You only have to get about 7 out of 10 of those right.
Are you saying that we don't have submediants and supertonics and 7 chords with specific functions to them?
Oh, all those things exist in some form or another. But putting a 6 under something doesn't really tell you anything about it. And you may be able to do it very well, but then if somebody asks you to compose a piece of music in the same style, you probably can't do anything. In other words, what you're learning about harmony. You're not actually learning harmony. I mean, if a person is able to make fine professional level harmonizations of a melody or a bass, you can almost guarantee that they learn that skill outside of a college or a university. Academic courses don't teach those skills.
If you go onto YouTube, you might see there's the people who talk about the 20 levels of harmony, and they have these incredible chord substitutions and that sort of thing. Are there modern theories of music, or really is this just counterpoint and just how you deal with notes against notes?
Well, certainly, I mean, what you're talking about sounds like it's coming out of a jazz tradition. And, in a jazz tradition, at least at the beginning, it's very chord-based. Now, when you get into the higher levels, it's much more counterpoint and melodically influenced. But, jazz education, at least some parts of it, is probably closer to what those conservatory kids did in the past. Just hundreds and even thousands of hours spent working on patterns, I mean, that's certainly true in jazz. And then, what you're talking about in terms of harmony is a kind of working out variations on things. And again, you can see the Paris Conservatory, they had entire pages where you'd have 20 harmonizations of the same melody or 20 harmonizations of the same bass. Those were skills that really helped create a rich understanding of what the underlying pattern was.
Could I ask about what your perspective is on perhaps, like we mentioned the Walter Piston book, but there's also Roger Sessions wrote a book on harmony, and all these 20th century books on quote unquote harmony that deal a lot with these chordal things. Are we to say that these books are also kind of for upper class kids learning music, and it's, if you really want to get to the real stuff, you have to dedicate yourself to a serious study of counterpoint?
Yeah, I would say that's true. Yes. At least, I'm talking about the classical tradition. If you want to understand the classical tradition, it comes through counterpoint. I mean, harmony was never a subject in Naples. There was never a course that you took called harmony. There's no question that chords exist from the simultaneous sounding of various tones, but several professors at the Paris Conservatory over the years have written that, in some sense, harmony is a kind of an illusion, and it's a byproduct of good counterpoint.
What is your opinion of classical music competitions?
Well, you're talking about performance, right?
Yes, I'm talking about the piano competitions, violin performance competitions, which seem to be dominating in terms of goals for what a lot of kids, when they pick up these instruments, that's really what they aim for.
Yes. Well, first, I think most of the people that head into that world don't fully understand how brutally competitive it is. And they may be unaware of the statistics. I'm blanking on the name of a young scholar, but he did a study of the piano competition circuit, the high level ones, the Van Cliburn and the Tchaikovsky competition, things like that. There were 2,000 musicians competing in that circuit. I don't think most people realize that it's that big, but it does mean that you have a 1 in 2,000 chance of winning. Yeah, I mean, I shouldn't really talk about that because I was never a studio teacher and I don't know the ins and outs of that. But I think it's a very brutal system, and whereas, well, for political reasons. But I mean, when Van Cliburn won the Tchaikovsky competition, he got a ticker tape parade in New York City, and for many, many years, the winner of the Van Cliburn competition would be front page news. Recently, during the last Van Cliburns, before his death, the winners did not even rate a mention in general purpose news outlets. So it's a really tough thing. That's why I think that learning to compose, learning to improvise, learning to express yourself, and in the process, learn to read and play comfortably, a variety of literature. I just think that's a more realistic and ultimately more rewarding goal than, learning to be the 1,513th best person. It's just so brutal.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of kids, they hate music as a result of it. They don't play anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's got the same profile as gymnastics or tennis or something like that, where the parents have to become kind of promoters of their children. The children's education becomes a full-time job, and they may have to move to a different city to work with a better coach and all that kind of stuff, and it's all very disruptive. Where it should be fun.
You worked with child prodigies, but you've also mentioned that this method works wonders, these old Italian methods, they work wonders with regular children who just were happening to learn music. If they approach music in this manner, they can really reap some benefits. Is that something that you've seen over the years, that if applying these old methods to anyone, I mean, children, adults, does it have a much more transformative effect than perhaps the more standard modern approach?
Yeah, I mean, like with young adults, I taught a class once. It was called figured bass, so that people would have some idea what the class was about, because you can't list a class on Partimento because nobody knows what the word means, but or at least then. So I was able to get the keyboard lab, which is a bunch of electronic keyboards all connected in a room. But we turned off all the complicated circuitry, and we just had everybody play into the open air in a class. About a dozen students. And the whole class was pretty much done without talking. I would play 2 or 3 notes and have somebody imitate them. And then I would make a variation on that, and then I would add a second voice. And we would just sort of speak back and forth musically for the full class. And these were people that had never done any kind of figured bass or things like that before. Well, by the end of the class, one student got a fellowship to go to Amsterdam and study with a top continuo player. I mean, they could do a lot. I mean, they were really
not just for prodigies.
certain...
A lot of people you can learn quickly.
Yes, quite frankly, it always was kid stuff. Imagine a class of 7-year-old orphans. They're far from prodigies. Many of them probably couldn't even read. So, doing things by ear is wonderful. Henri Bousser, in the Child Composer's book, is quoted as saying that, he was a professional musician by 18, but he'd never used a book of any kind for any of his studies. All his teachers taught by ear.
Professor Gjerdingen, you won the Wallace Berry Award from the Society of Music Theory. Have you seen a change in perception of music theory with regard to perhaps schemata analysis, Partimento, thorough bass? How has it changed over the years? Have you really seen marked difference in how people are looking at this 18th century music and 19th century music?
There has been a change. I mean, when I first started doing some of this stuff, people thought it was just made up out of whole cloth, that I was just selling some kind of like phony product, And
did you get some pushback?
Oh, absolutely.
Can you give an example?
But no, because people would be able to figure out who
okay.
the saying it was. But people told me that, well, this stuff, it isn't really music, is it? So, there are different levels. First of all, in North America, it sounds strange to say, but honest to goodness, there was a great deal of prejudice against Italians and Italian music. Heinrich Schenker says some really disgusting things about Italian musicians. He compares them to organ grinders' monkeys, okay? And, Britain had a German royal family. So, Queen Victoria played four-hand music with Mendelssohn. They spoke German at court.
in England.
And so the Americans picked up on that. That we emulated the British, and the British esteemed German music. And so we picked up on that, and that became our tradition. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, what's not to like in Bach and Mozart and Beethoven?
Right.
But Italian music fell into a kind of blind spot where it was considered, just that all they do is opera, and it's not very good and that sort of thing. So there was that prejudice. And then the other thing is that, talking about the different social classes, academic musicians tended to think of the professional musicians, the conservatory-trained musicians, as not very smart. That, okay, they're able to do it, but they don't actually know what they're doing. There was a German professor, Siegfried Dehn, in Berlin in the middle of the 19th century, and he said, well, yes, they do all these things, but they don't have a theory of harmony, so they don't really know what they're doing. So there was prejudice against this sort of stuff. And, well, in terms of Society of Music Theory, it's very hard for these big schools to give up on these bogus harmony classes. It's the bread and butter of what they do. There are dozens of sections of these courses. Across the country, there's tens of thousands, 100,000 people taking these courses, and to admit that they're mostly useless
But that's interesting, Professor Gjerdingen. Isn't Heinrich Schenker, who you mentioned in the last interview, he didn't like Roman numerals and he was very much into counterpoint. But isn't he kind of more popular in American universities now?
Well, I think so, although I think the high water mark of that has passed. But yes, I mean, he, bless his soul, he believed in counterpoint. He believed in figured bass. That's how he viewed this music. And it was a very wise and historically supported choice. So again, to get good at Schenkerian analysis, it's like apprenticing in a craft, and it takes more time than a typical curriculum can allow.
To end off, I would like to ask, what's your plan with Partimenti.org?
Oh, well, it's just planned as a massive resource for all the wonderful lessons from the past that can be made available to people today.
Do you have new books and new articles planned for the future?
Well, I'm thinking about a couple things, but I haven't started anything. I've just been working on the Partimenti.org for the last few months, and that'll probably keep me busy for a while yet.
Were you friends with Professor Daniel Hertz, who recently passed away?
No, I wasn't. And I believe that he didn't actually like schema theory very much. That's what I'm told. I mean, I'm friends with his students, and I'm a fan of his, but he wasn't a fan of mine. I think there are various issues at play there. One is that where he taught, the University of California at Berkeley, they never actually had any kind of program or professors in music theory. I think they always thought of it as somewhat sort of applied music, and they would hire adjunct people to do that kind of thing. So I don't think he really thought very highly of music theory in general. And then, schema theory popped up very late in his life. And maybe it was just something he wasn't interested in pursuing. But I'm a fan of his, and I was disappointed that he wasn't that interested in it, because he was a great expert on that music.
I asked another colleague of yours, Professor William Kaplan, talking about the work and how the schemas apply to form. Could you comment on that subject?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some cases where a certain kind of schema is used in a certain place in a piece. But then in other cases, I think they're too generic for that. So it's not like one size fits all. He has a long-standing and important interest in musical form, so that sort of pops into his mind. I've always thought that form is one of the two of between tonality and form. Those are things that we pretend that we can talk about, whereas in truth, they're both ridiculously difficult to try and understand. They happen in real time, and they're part of an evolving awareness of a person experiencing a very complex artwork as it unfolds. So it's never been a great interest of mine, but I can see the interest that people have in it, and certainly some schemas are associated with particular places in musical forms. I think that's fair.
You mentioned that children are amazing, and this is, maybe you could give a final statement maybe to parents who are thinking about, hey, I want to see if my kid could maybe take music lessons or maybe get into music. What would you recommend for parents who have kids and they think, all right, I want to get my kids to start music. How should they do it?
I wish I had a good answer for that. One of the answers is just do it. Just start. It doesn't matter if you have a grand piano or you just have a kazoo. It's the doing. So get your children doing music. If you can find a friend and they can learn together, it'll go so much better, because children are so responsive to peer pressure and the idea that their friend is doing this too, and so they want to be as good as Billy or Jill or whatever. They can go online. They can find simple exercises. At Partimenti.org, there are already some very basic things under the About Partimenti category. And, they should reach out. There are you yourself and other people are very open to helping parents think of things that their kids could do. And I think progressive music teachers, private teachers, are becoming increasingly willing to, try some more creative things rather than just having the children drill on exercises and stock repertoire. But the main thing is just to start.
Well, Professor Gjerdingen, thank you so much for coming on the show again. I love your book. I really recommend people buy the book. It's called Child Composers in the Old Conservatories, How Orphans Became Elite Musicians. It's very recently released. And please go to partimenti.org and also go subscribe to the YouTube channel, Child Composers. Professor Gjerdingen, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Bye-bye now.